Hey everybody, Brian here, and thanks for listening. For the last few weeks, I've been on a bit of a tear on vouchers and budgets, test scores, and I thought I probably needed to take a step back. I got back from giving a speech in New Jersey to a bunch of educators and civic leaders also. They weren't just educators, but they were civic leaders and city council people and some state legislators. And the one thing that I was a little taken back about was the lack of awareness on how important public schools were. I mean, they all knew that education was important. Nobody was fighting education, but they didn't really understand the significance in history and in cultures of public education. So today I thought I would back up a little bit and do a little bit of a history lesson. And so actually I'm going to take a few thousand steps back because we're going to kind of jump back to the ancient foundations and really try to understand the challenges and opportunities that are facing public education today through a lens of, well, how we got here, right? So, what's the old adage? If those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Well, we want to repeat some good parts of history, but we just want to be picky, right? So let's back up a little bit and let's go to like our ancient foundations in public education. And the first thing that always pops up in my mind is Sparta. And you probably, if you didn't see the movie Sparta, you ought to watch it. And like if you're into, war and combat shows, it's really pretty good. But there's some aspects in that movie that are very accurate. Some that are not so accurate, but some that are very accurate. So in Sparta, boys were taken from their homes at the age of 7 to enter, what do they call it? The agago. Now remember, I was this kid with a speech impediment, and public schools really helped me, so I'm still like loyal to them. But I will mispronounce names. Please don't beat me up too much. I'm doing the best I can. The Argo, Agoge. Right. Anyway, and this was a state-run military type school, and it emphasized obedience, strength, loyalty, especially loyalty to Sparta. And education wasn't about personal growth as much as it was really about creating soldiers and citizens who could serve the state. So even back then, education was still wrapped around serving the greater community. This particular community was very focused on war, like citizen soldiers, so to speak. And this was one of the earliest examples of compulsory state-sponsored education. I mean, I couldn't find any data that said that the Spartans had to pay to send their boys, but all boys went to it, right? And so the state had to be funding that, feeding them, and sending on people to train them to fight. And it was interesting. One thing that Sparta gets a lot of props for creating this massive military enterprise, but since they were only focused or primarily focused on the military aspects, their civilization certainly suffered because they weren't trying to create well-rounded individuals. Just something to kind of keep in mind. Now, meanwhile, in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, think south of Sparta, right? Education served a different purpose. So in Mesopotamia, they had schools called, I'm going to mess it up again, Edubas, somebody can correct me, Edubbas. And they trained scribes and writers to like maintain history and to teach, right? So the scribes maintained records, there were contracts, they managed trade, and their education was much more rigorous around rote memorization, copying, and the study of mathematics and literature, right? So now, if you think about the societies and cultures that thrived more, Sparta or Egypt? Well, if you know your history, you know that Egypt dominated the ancient world. Like Sparta did great. They did some pretty cool things, but it wasn't no Egypt, right? Egypt, I mean, their society blossomed for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands, depending on which historian you listen to. And they were really focused on this more global collective student, right? Rote memorization was certainly a part of that. And so there was one fable, and I cannot remember the name of the student that was that, but here's how the fable goes, right? So it was a scribe, and he was writing on clay tablets, and he broke one. And instead of getting mad and angry, like, how dare you break that? That took a lot of hours. The teacher, in this case, made the student do copy it 20 times. They then had to copy it 20 times. Now, this wasn't like copying it 20 times on a blackboard with a piece of chalk like I had to do when I was a kid. This was a clay tablet. So 20 was a lot of work. But what it taught was perfection, rote memorization, and learning through actually doing something, right? So the teacher sent the student back, and that student became a great scribe and teacher in his own right. So now in Egypt, education was more tied to religion and governance than like in Sparta, the soldiers, right? So it was religion and governance. So the temples, and you'll see that, especially as we get to the Middle Ages, temples and houses of worship did serve as schools a lot. And a lot of times the most learned people in a society came out of these religious institutions. So Egypt, the temple served as schools, and students learned hieroglyphics, astronomy, medicine, administrative duties, all under the guidance of priests/teachers, right? So the education was limited, though, to elite males. Now, I'm a guy, I'm a man, if you didn't know, and men will get a lot of, men always got education and the women didn't. Well, it wasn't all men, it was elite men. So it was still very segmented to a very small group of people, unlike Sparta, that taught all their boys, not their girls, all their boys obedience, strength, and loyalty, right? So the elite males started to get education even back in ancient times. And this was to prepare them for roles either, to become a priest or in governmental systems. All right. So at the same time, on kind of the other, not the other side of the globe, but 30% over in the globe, and let's talk about China, right? So Confucius, he revolutionized thinking about education in general. And so much about what we get, even in the Western world, comes from Confucius. And he believed that learning was like really essential to moral development and being a good member of society, right? And so we still get this undercurrent throughout all types of education that it was about the collective. It was about serving society, not just the individual, but serving society. How does society benefit? And Confucius really dug into this. And the Chinese gave a civil service exam based on Confucius' text that ensured that all public officials were selected based on merit, not birthright. And this was a concept that influenced future models of standardized testing. So if you wonder, like, where does standardized testing come from? Well, you blame it on Confucius. It wasn't our politicians here in the States. It was Confucius, kind of a standardized format to judge people and determine their worth. Now, Confucius and in China did start to really leverage this, this thought that maybe a person's success should be based on their merit and their ability to grow individually, not based on what class they were born into. And that was a very foreign concept. I mean, it used to be, if you were born in this class, you were going to do this. If you were born in this class, you were born in this. And thank gosh, Confucius did this, because, here in the States, the whole concept is people can rise from little to whatever they want to be if they put in the effort, to put in the work, and et cetera, all those things. And I mean, that was the American dream. Hopefully it still is. And it was Confucius that said, let's really reward people based on merit, not birthright. So this goes all the way back to ancient China, and it's pretty cool, right? So now let's kind of go back over the other side of the bay, and let's talk about Greece. Now, everybody's probably heard that Greece is very scholarly at the time that it was hitting its apex, and that in Athens, wealthy boys, really excelled, and they were really the model of an educated society, right? Where people got to learn and grow. It was still only wealthy boys, though. They learned grammar, philosophy, rhetoric to prepare for civic life. Again, not focused in Sparta, like just in combat, right? So in contrast, Plato and Aristotle started to lay the foundation for all Western education, they would blend these concepts like logic and theory and ethics. And they started to kind of start to compose real rigorous curriculum around this. And together, these early civilizations, all these different civilizations really reveal that education was reflecting society values, right? And maybe it was religion, maybe it was virtue, maybe it was power, maybe it was combat, maybe it was war, whatever it was. Society kind of dictated the education model. So we knew this thousands of years ago that what society wants out of its population, it needs to teach and educate. So, I mean, let that digest for a minute, right? And this is, so like if you're in business, if you're in education, whatever, if you want to get certain goals out of your life, if you want to be rewarded for specific goals, you need to know where you're going. You need to know where you're heading. You should train yourself and teach yourself to fixate on those goals. Well, that's what education does for an entire society, right? I mean, if all you want is citizen soldiers, train them for that. If all you want is theoreticians and philosophers, well, train them for that. If you want a well-rounded student, train them for that. But make no doubt, what you train your children is what you end up with. All right, let's fast forward a little bit to the Middle Ages, all right? Now, the Middle Ages was really this fall of the Roman Empire. And I'm not going to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. There's so many people that kind of break that down. It's really fascinating there. If you get bored, you go find some great sites on the fall of Rome. But when the fall of Rome occurred, education in Europe just about collapsed, which some would say led to the Dark Ages, right? I mean, there's certainly some debate on what led to the Dark Ages, but we do know that one of the reasons why it was called the Dark Ages is because a lack of society improvements. Culture really did not get better. I mean, at the time of the Romans and the Greeks, we had aqueducts and they were building these massive concrete structures and homes, and they had Rome had sanitation. The ancient Sumerians had sanitation, now that I think about it. Sumerians, which was even 1,500 years before this or so, they had sanitation. They had a way, like within their house, you'd go to the bathroom and clean water would be pumped in and the bad water would be pumped out. If you go to the Middle Ages, in a lot of cases, there was no sanitation. And so just think about that from a cultural standpoint, is people didn't understand. They weren't taught plumbing. They weren't taught engineering. So when we say that we lost something and we had to regain it, that's absolutely true, because society wasn't focused on training the youth. Education collapsed, okay? So you saw what happened is that there was a 300 to 500 year run of society in general did not improve. There was no great technological advances, no great medical cures that occurred because we weren't training our kids. I know I'm on a soapbox. I get so frustrated. I'm sorry, right? So most of the training during the Middle Ages was around churches. And the most educated person during this time was often the local priest or monks or what have you. So monastic schools taught reading, writing, Latin to future priests and monks, not to all of society. And the goal wasn't civic participation at the time. So remember, in these ancient societies, which so many of us look up, man, they really had great societies back then, and then we kind of fell apart. Well, they were focused on civic preparation, how to serve the global society, where during the Middle Ages, it was training and learning was more around salvation, right? So people were taught and focused on salvation, not on building a better society. So you kind of lead to the Dark Ages, right? So then you had cathedral schools that began to develop in a lot of major cities, and these were the precursors to medieval universities, right? So when did universities started? Well, cathedral schools got converted into universities, and most of your universities, by the way, even the ones in the States, have religious backgrounds. And then they some of them still hold that, some of them have drifted away from that. All right. So now let's talk about the Islamic world. And it is interesting that we're in the West. And so oftentimes we look at history from a Western perspective instead of a global perspective. And I thought it was really important to kind of dig into what was the Islamic world doing during the 8th and 13th century? Well, learning was thriving there. They did not have the Dark Ages. I mean, they might have had a Dark Ages at some other point, but it wasn't the 8th to the 13th century. So cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo became global centers of scholarship. There in Baghdad, there was a place called the House of Wisdom. Isn't that a cool name? The House of Wisdom. And translated into Greek and Roman texts. Let me back up. the House of Wisdom was where different religions came together. Christians, Muslims, Arabics, Jewish, they came together and collectively shared knowledge. That's pretty cool. Like medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and they taught law, philosophy, science, and all faiths and all religions shared, and that information got disseminated across the different parts of the world. And so because they chose to share in knowledge, the entire world ultimately began to benefit from it. I mean, somebody else, developed algebra, and now it got shared through, to the much dismay of many students that don't want to study algebra. It does help with things, right? And this really came out of the House of Wisdom, this global group that came together and all faiths did it. So pretty cool. So this I think, this is just my theory here, is that this sharing of knowledge got moved back through to the Western world and started turning into like the Renaissance, right? Which reunited interest in classical text and human growth and potential. So it wasn't just about salvation of the soul, it was about growth of the entire person, right? And certainly the soul too, right? Which is still pretty important. So education then like really began to move beyond just the church. It emphasized the humanities, reason, and here's an awesome one, critical thinking. Anyone think today that maybe we're missing some of that in our current education formats? Like we're missing that critical thinking. We're maybe focused a little bit too much on standardized tests. Well, the Renaissance started bringing back critical thinking. And this is when like the printing press came to be, which revolutionized the access to education. Very cool. And then thinkers like Rouse came in and Locke and argued that education should promote individual liberty and prepare citizens to govern themselves. So the state had a role to play in all this in helping to educate the population, not just for religious purposes, but also for civic and economic reasons. Now Locke will get a lot of credit for like coming up with this idea that the state should help educate people beyond just religious texts, but also for civic and economic reasons. But now that the ancients were doing that 1,000 years before this. That wasn't a new concept. It was a concept that needed to come back into being. So when you start to think about the United States, think about things that we've lost and we've come back to. But because Locke studied history, he probably knew that the ancients did it for civic and economic reasons, and he brought that to the forefront again, which was really important. I don't want to discount that, but it wasn't a novel idea. It was an idea that needed to have a rebirth. And so, it was pretty cool. Now, the interesting thing is, in Prussia, during, I think this is around the 1700s or so. So it was the 18th century. It was on the earlier side of the 18th century. So early 1700s. Is Prussia made it law. They made that teaching and education should go beyond religious purposes and help improve civic and economics. And it became law. All right. So Prussia also introduced the idea of compulsory elementary education. They were the first one in modern times to say, we are going to educate, at least to elementary level, all of our kids. And by the late 1700s, they'd built a national school system with trained teachers, standardized curriculum, government oversight, and the system deeply impressed an American at the time, Horace Mann, right? So Horace Mann, he traveled from the New World. He was in Prussia, later turned into Germany and stuff. And he said, this is amazing. So I think it was in 1843. Yep. My notes say it's 1843 that Mann visited Prussia, and he returned to the U.S. with a vision of free, universal, non-sectarian public schools supported by you, the taxpayer, right? And so he said, we got to do this. This only makes sense. You train your population. You make sure that they have good civics. They understand economics. They understand how to be grow and contribute to society. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. And it had been done for thousands of years since the ancients. We fell off a little bit during the Middle Ages. And he said, like, let's bring this back. And so he became the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. And he led a crusade for public education as a tool to promote democracy and economic progress, right? So can you have a vigorous economy if people are all dum-dums, like uneducated? Not really. Are you destined to repeat the lessons of the past if you don't teach people history? Yes. And man saw this and he did something about it. Pretty cool, right? So man believed that schools should not just create workers, but actually like good citizens. And he saw education as a great equalizer, which I think we can all see that it is a great equalizer, right? But he was one of the ones to really identify this, and it was pretty cutting edge at that point in time. And it was a way to, I'm going to use the term, level the playing field in a country that promised opportunity for everyone. So he said, well, we promise opportunity for everyone. Let's actually deliver on that promise. And it was man that really brought that to, and I don't know if he gets enough credit, right? So over time, states across the entire United States began to adopt the common school model was kind of what it was called, right? So by the late 1800s, compulsory schools and law spread across the nation. Immigrants, freed slaves, working class families gained access to education through, even though access was still far from equal. Like, I don't want to be like, oh, education was equal. It was not equal, but it was on the trajectory. It was headed on the right path, right? And I think that improvement is the name of the game. Improvement is the name of the game. You don't want to take two steps forward and one step back, and you don't want to have education fall apart. But it certainly got better and better and better, even though it wasn't open up to everybody. For sure, it needed to be. We're getting there, right? And so another thing that came out of Europe and from Germany was kindergarten. And kindergarten was also imported from Germany in the mid 1800s. And kindergarten is actually a German word. If you think kindergarten, like child, young children. Anyway, so and then higher education after this began to expand through like colleges, especially these colleges that were converted or were religious to start with, but then began to convert into, secondary schools and universities and colleges and things like that, especially as we became more industrialized. So America's public school system became this awesome model for inclusion, innovation, and like social change, even though it didn't help everybody at the same speed. All right. So let's just kind of spend a couple minutes in the 20th century to figure out where we are today. So in the 20th century, education became a real global priority. I mean, there were certainly a lot of nations that shunned public education. And those civilizations, well, let's think about Syria. Let's think about Iran. It's interesting. If you look at Iran in the early 1970s, late 1960s, you would have seen pictures of a very modern society, one with an upward trajectory. Their population was being educated. They had a rule of law, and then they became very dominated by, well, we'll call it perceived religious control, right? Where they stopped educating the women. They stopped educating all the boys, right? And they had a very religious system that was honed in on well, kind of like the Middle Ages. If you really want to look at it, like, we're going to focus on saving the soul and not building a well-rounded human being, right? So, like, I'm not trying to say that religious training is not important. It is. But if that's the only training you get, you end up with countries like Syria, Iran, and you end up with the Middle Ages. I mean, that's just the data, guys. You want a well-rounded person that contributes to society. I mean, they're the facts, right? Somebody's going to yell at me, man. I guess that's all right. So in the 20th century, education became this global priority, and colonial nations demanded schools. So you think colonial nations of not just the United States had some, but really talking about the British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese, the Spanish, et cetera, all had these colonial nation states, colonial empires. And the colonies started demanding, schools, especially as they sought their independence. And then other international organizations began to promote universal education as a human right. I mean, it's not a human right yet, but it would be pretty cool if it was, right? So, and then you had progressive educators like John Dewey that challenged that challenged rigid test-heavy models and promoted, experiential learning, creative learning, problem solving, critical thinking, not just standardized testing, right? And so he argued that education should reflect the democracy itself, a space where students learn by doing, questioning, and participating. A little bit of a tangent here. I get John Dewey's thoughts, right? And I used to be a lot more John Dewey-ish, I think, in my view of education, that you should learn by doing, questioning, and participating. The issue with that is it doesn't really equate as much of a well-rounded education as I think is important in a time of really technological revolution, right? Things have changed so dramatically in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, we're looking at the cusp of AI. When I was a kid, we didn't have computers. I took a computer class where I had to put in zeros and ones. And now, we got computers everywhere. This is more powerful than the first spaceship that orbited the moon, right? It's crazy how things have advanced. So we do certainly need well-rounded citizens. And that starts by educating them on the front end, right? So John Dewey's the doing, questioning, and participating. The world is moving, I think, too fast just to do that. I do believe in that, by the way. I think that children getting their hands dirty and learning how to do things and build things and using algebra or geometry to build a table or whatever is invaluable type training. But I do think you gotta teach more than the global, more than just the things that they can participate in, right? I think Dewey had a point for the early 20th century. I think we got to kind of evolve as we go. Now, by the mid-1900s, most developed nations really did have established mass public school systems. The U.S., we saw major shifts during this time of desegregation, special education laws, and massive debates over curriculum value. And then kind of in the later 1900s, especially around the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which led to the Department of Education, we got a lot of laws that started protecting students. Americans with Disabilities Act, you got Civil Rights Act, 1964. You got Title IX, which allowed a lot of women, to participate in what they want to do, sports and things like that. So you had all these laws to start protecting rights and continuing to make education more and more accessible to more and more people. Pretty cool stuff, right? Now, we're in the 21st century, right? And we've got all these new challenges, the digital revolution, transforming learning, online schools, virtual schools, AI tutors, all this different stuff. But I thought it was important to take a little time today to let you know how we got here, right? That this wasn't, a concept that the United States developed. It was a concept developed over thousands of years. And I think what I should probably do next is explain to you every nation and every society that's turned away from good quality, well-rounded education with critical thinking, some standardized testing, that framework, and how they've all suffered. I think maybe I dig into that next time. If you like that, send me an email, put a comment down here or whatever. See if that's something you're interested in going to. I do think it's important that we've got to remember that we've been struggling with how to educate our society for thousands of years. This is no different. We can get through this. We can do this right now. But we've got to defend what's working and what has been working. And we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And free public education is an absolute must for a vibrant society. I think that that's my lesson for you today. Now, what exactly that means, we can debate endlessly. Hey, I hope this was fun for you. I kind of enjoyed putting it together. So thanks for listening. Bye.